Hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and today's program, we're going to revisit perhaps the most important geopolitical issue of the 21st century. That's China's place in the world. And we're calling this program The China Nightmare, after a book of the same name written by Dan Blumenthal, who you'll meet in a minute. Our other guest is Cynthia Watson. And for regular viewers, you will recognize that she's been with us over the years, and she's the person who personally gave me a tour of China 15 years ago. Now, you're going to hear perspectives on China that probably you haven't heard in other places. And so I'm going to ask my co-host, Jim Cathcart, to introduce those two guests. Jim, it's all yours.
I'm happy to do that. Thank you very much, Dennis. Our guests today are Dr. Cynthia Watson. She's the interim provost and vice president for academic affairs at the National Defense University. She's a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and the Society for Military History. Her first edition, 2002, of U.S. National Security received Choices designation as Book of the Year. Today, she is speaking in her own capacity. Welcome to the program, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Also, our feature, the topic, The China Nightmare, comes from author Dan Blumenthal. Dan is the Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security and Sino-American relations. He's served and advised the U.S. government on China issues for over a decade. He has also served as the John A. Buren Chair, Distinguished Visiting Professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
This is a compelling title, The China Nightmare. Tell us what you had in mind and what's the basic premise of the book.
Well, thank you. It's the China Nightmare, the grand ambitions of a decaying state. I didn't choose all the words on the subtitle, but the basic premise is China has grand ambitions and is much more powerful than it was 20, 30 years ago, but also is beset by weaknesses and vulnerabilities that will actually make it more dangerous in the coming years.
When you look at China today and you think about strengths and weaknesses, I think the public is mostly perceiving just great strength because that's what the media seems to say about China. How do we put that in perspective?
The strengths, as you say, are what we focus on because we're focused on a new great power rival and a new great power competitor. So we're focused on a massive military modernization program, which I describe at some length in my book, which can challenge the United States in its traditional areas of strength around Japan and East Asia. We're focused on lots and very large and fast economic growth since 1980, which is starting to slow down, but certainly has been quite a feat. A lot of wealth accumulation and so forth. We're looking at a country that has competitive industry and commercial competitive in the technology space and elsewhere. So those are the strengths. Some of the strengths I think we focus on. On the side of weaknesses, I think people are coming around to see that China has a really drastically terrible demographic situation and is getting old very quickly before it's fully rich. Its other weaknesses are a political system that I argue in my book is more calcified than I think is commonly known or acknowledged. Problems of legitimacy, problems of internal strife, and there are other ones we can get into as well.
One of the things that we've seen since 1995 and the Taiwan Strait crisis that related in 95, 96 to elections in Taiwan was a decided choice by China to modernize the People's Liberation Army Navy, which had not traditionally been the part of the People's Liberation Army, the collective term for their military, that they had focused on. China now sees its threats in many ways as coming from the sea because they focus on the United States and the role that the United States has with a number of countries, many of which are allies, that are along China's coast. They now want to have a military that will allow them to project around the world, and they have set about developing that. Dan described it as a massive modernization. I know others have said that it is commensurate with a state which has seen its growth economically to be tremendous over the same time period. So perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised by that. But it is definitely a military that has a much greater emphasis on naval power than it has historically.
All right, thank you. And Dan, in your book, you write about something which I found interesting, that China had problems from a naval perspective before. So give us just a brief history of why China would be particularly concerned about the sea and how they compete there.
Well, as Cynthia said, in contemporary times, they were challenged by us in 1996, 1997 in the Taiwan Strait. And we sent in aircraft carriers when they were testing missiles around the Taiwan Strait to quiet them down. And they don't want to be humiliated. They want to have their way on Taiwan. But I think what you're referring to in the book is I have some historical chapters about the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty. And one of the ways that the Chinese leaders now assess their problems or assess how to avoid problems is that there was a combination of not keeping up with the Industrial Revolution in the 1600s and the 1700s and being humiliated by British power, British naval power, as well as not being able to tamp down internal strife. So there's some echoes that they don't like to past Chinese history that they're trying to avoid very much right now.
Draw that parallel for us. You know, we see the growth, and then you see the problems inside.
Well, I think that some of the ways they want to deal with avoiding what they see, for example, Xi Jinping, the president of China, is almost, I would say, obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and his review and assessment of one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed was too much openness to the West that brought in all kinds of ideas about Western governance, democracy, liberal ideas, and too much economic reform. And so he says that actually to avoid that, China needs to clamp down on economic reforms, needs to keep new ideas out of China, and buck up the ideological underpinnings of the Chinese Communist Party. So that is one piece of history that really haunts him. But in doing so, I think in this kind of ideological clampdown and this more ideological based governance, he's actually hurting China's economic growth. So there are dilemmas he's facing.
Well, without a doubt, Dan. And Cynthia, you've studied China for a long time, back to the Qing dynasty, of course, but give us sort of from Deng through Jiang to Hu to Xi in terms of how they've looked at the world and China's place, and then tell us what they mean when they say they are the Middle Kingdom.
China's, a lot of what we're talking about is not just a China that's worried about what the world can do to it today, but a China beginning in the 1840s, when the British first came up the Pearl River Delta and were able to force China open through what we call the Opium Wars, and allowed the British and then the US and other states, particularly from the West, to operate in China freely without being limited by the central government in Beijing or the Qing dynasty, being able to stop them in a way that was believed to be something that a unique culture, meaning the Middle Kingdom between the celestial heavens and everyone else, could historically stop the rest of the world. There's a lot of fanciful ideas that permeate Chinese history, as tends to permeate the history of any nation. But in this particular case, I think that a lot of what China is worried about relates to the fact that under the period when Mao first tried to consolidate power in 1949 to his death in 1976, China turned within and saw itself fall behind the rest of the world. So Deng Xiaoping reopened the doors, as did those that you mentioned after him, who were able to see a way to bring in foreign ideas and foreign capital and technology to improve the economy. What we now see, however, is Xi Jinping recognizing that that may have undermined the strength of the party, and that that may be something that he thinks he can only control by stopping those ideas, as Dan said. The problem with that is that China is today integral in many ways with the global economy, and it's going to be hard to simply turn that relationship off.
Yeah, well put, Cynthia. Now, Dan, you talked about the phrase that they use, which is the community of common destiny. How does that relate to what Xi is trying to do, not only internally in China, but throughout the world, and especially with its neighbors?
Yeah, so my analysis in the book is that China is now looking at an opportunity to not just take its place in the world, but actually to shape a world order more favorable to the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's not necessarily the case that they will succeed. And you need to gain some international legitimacy for that grand project. The community of common destiny is a phrase often used by Chinese leaders and Chinese diplomats to try to soothe international concerns about its rise and its ambitions, and to say that they don't ever say this explicitly, but implicitly, that the United States has been dominant and domineering and hegemonic in its leadership of the world order, and China will be more harmonious and will set a new world order that is beneficial to all, a community of common destiny. And so that's become very important in Chinese diplomatic mantra and so forth. Of course, the problem is there's no evidence that China would actually do that. If you look at some of the very grave human rights abuses at home and treatment of ethnic minorities and so forth. But it's a very important part of the diplomatic template at this point.
Could I just add that I think, to build on what Dan just said, the Chinese like to talk about, and have for 60 plus years, talked about the idea that they will not interfere in the sovereign affairs of other states. That is certainly open to debate, but what we see is a charge that the United States has always intervened in the affairs of other states, and China hasn't. The problem is it's a selective use of history at best.
Well, Cynthia, putting this in historical perspective, I don't think there's ever been an autocratic country that, with the attitude China has, that we must control information flow and virtually control thought, has ever succeeded for any enduring period of time. But they've certainly been able to pose a massive threat. When I was there last, I remember my lecture agent asked me, he's Chinese, he said, when you think of China, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I said, culture and history and the Chinese legacy from all these centuries. And I said, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the U.S.? Freedom. He said it that fast. I mean, there wasn't a breath between my question and his answer, freedom. That's clearly what all humans want, but oppressive regimes suppress that, I think, to their own peril. What are your observations on all that?
I have a different view. I don't think freedom is something that is nearly as quick to come to the tongues of Chinese. I think what they are more concerned about is the idea of stability. And I think that the problems that confront us are not simply problems because of the Communist Party being in charge of China. I think that China simply has very different aspirations than the United States does. And I frankly believe we would have long-term challenges with anyone in China as China becomes a more prosperous society and one that is able to spend its way around the world. That is not a commonly held view in Washington right now. But I do think that the idea of governing China is much, much harder than we realize. And therefore, there are many Chinese who are very tolerant in some what we would see as sad ways at some of the state's behavior because they are worried about that form of chaos that would lead to instability. And instability has brought down regime after regime historically in China.
Well, you're exactly right. And of course, they look at what brought down the former Soviet Union, and Tiananmen Square happened, by the way, in the same year in 1989. Now, Dan, to tag on to what Cynthia just said, I have taught a lot of Chinese students at the university in the last few years. And while I've shown them videos of different, let's say, American security people and their views of China, and frankly, those views are frightening. I asked the students after I showed them one, I said, what do you think of that? And how do you reconcile that with the fact that you're here in America studying? And to a person, they said that we recognize that we've had to give up freedoms. They never had them. That is, they were not going to have any freedoms and privacy, et cetera. But because they felt that they and their parents were much better off than their grandparents economically, that they were willing to make that trade-off. How does that play out, Dan, from your perspective?
So very complicated picture, but I think when you get specific and you say, wouldn't you rather have the freedom to gather, the freedom to post what you want on Weibo, you get a much different answer than the sort of general abstract term freedom.
Dan, Chinese are growing and expanding and expecting a middle-class lifestyle instead of like their parents and the ones before them. What are the implications of all this as you see it in your observations?
Well, I have in my book some of the statistics, and they're worrying for China and for everyone concerned with human health as well as with economic growth, because China will be as old as Europe in 2030 without near the per capita income. So it is truly getting old before it gets rich, which has enormous implications for the future of economic growth, has enormous implications for the kinds of social spending that would be necessary to keep up with that, enormous pressures on the one that you mentioned before to take care of a larger family in a context without cousins, without uncles and aunts, a lot of pressures, financial, fiscal, social pressures on young Chinese as well. And there's no real sign of reversing that process. That's baked into the cake. So every time I think China is posing formidable problems for the United States, but every time I hear that China is in fact taking over in terms of economic growth and wealth, I'm very skeptical because of some of those statistics.
Yeah, Cynthia, I think you probably agree with some of that. And adding to that, there's the debt, which is, I think, Dan, in your book, you wrote about 250% of GDP, which is worse than the U.S. There's the internal rot, political rot. There's the fact that they've become a national security state, as America is, and they're an empire declining, as some people could say America is. Cynthia, how would you react to those things?
Well, there is no question that by indications of what we can figure out, and there is an awful lot we don't know about their spending. They spend more on internal security than they do on the People's Liberation Army and on foreign security. There is also the one thing we haven't mentioned, and Dan, I thought was getting to it, but it's not just that you're down to one child. but you have such a disproportionate number of male children to female children, and therefore the social problems that result from that, and simply the desperation of finding a spouse. So when I talk about what keeps the leadership up at night in China, I think that it is overwhelmingly domestic issues. And then this issue that you just mentioned, Dennis, about corruption, or you called it rot, it's very clear that Xi Jinping, when he took over in 2012, recognized that many people saw the party as nothing but a shell of anything other than a corrupt institution. The problem with corruption campaigns, though, as we've seen, is it's really hard to go from a corruption campaign that's to get rid of the overall corruption at all levels, to keep that from becoming a purge of those who might oppose you. And that's what we think we see today, because at the end of the day, 10 years into it, it looks like the people that were brought down were those who might have been a threat to Xi Jinping rather than just those who might have been corrupt. So it's a very hard place to govern, and it's a hard place to see things really turning into what we would see as a positive near-term future.
Thank you, Cynthia. When you look at it that way, it's easy to see how China is having a nightmare inside its own boundaries. But we've also got the fact, Dan, that this is a nightmare potentially for the rest of the world if they throw their weight around in the wrong ways, in the wrong places. Your editors gave you a subtitle, "The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State." I think that's a pretty good statement. Would you explain to us how it's a nightmare outside of China?
Certainly, for all kinds of reasons. I mean, these internal problems are not making them less hawkish on Taiwan. They're actually more hawkish, more prone to use force. Same thing with the gross and grave human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I have a very quick afterword I did, during COVID. I mean, we see like some of the governance instincts and inclinations to cover things up inside China, and to wish away problems, and to stop journalists from reporting and stop doctors from reporting. We see the kind of effect it has on the rest of the world. That was truly a nightmare, still is for us. So I think because, as Cynthia said, China is so intertwined with the global economy and so forth, it cannot contain its problems internally.
Yeah, we're coming up on closing time, so we need to wrap this very quickly. Can you, in just a sentence or so, tell us what you feel the next thing we need to do is? And we really are short on time. Sorry for that.
Well, I'll go first, I guess. I think because I view the next 5 to 10 years as a dangerous period where Xi Jinping will look to expand and lock in some gains. And it's not like he doesn't know what I'm talking about in terms of internal problems, that we need to do some of the things we've been doing, which is build a coalition of allies ready to stop Chinese expansionism, to stop the takeover of Taiwan, to make sure that China's predatory economic and technological behavior is undermined as well.
Thank you. Cynthia, very quickly, your observation.
I think we need to focus on our relationship with our allies and partners and recognize that we're not very likely to change Chinese behavior. That doesn't make us feel good, but I think realistically, China believes that it is entitled to certain behavior, and they are likely to pursue that, including the issue of Taiwan. So building against that is important.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, Cynthia. Folks, thank you for joining us today. This is a vitally important issue that affects us all. You may not have had the privilege of traveling to China like each of us have, but clearly China is a part of your world every single day. And that's why we here at this program recognize that society advances based on the people who are thinking and caring deeply. That's why we are always bringing you different perspectives on things that matter for people who care.